I stared at Jack, my husband of 15 years, wondering if I'd heard him correctly. "You want us to move in with your mother?" The words felt foreign on my tongue, like a phrase from a language I'd never learned. Jack's eyes darted away from mine, focusing on the framed photo of us on our wedding day. "It's just temporary, Claire. Mom's having a hard time since Dad passed. She needs us." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. "And what about what we need, Jack? What about our plans?" He shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes about his indifference. "Plans change. Mom's alone now. It's the right thing to do." The right thing. How many times had I heard that phrase throughout our marriage? I bit back a bitter laugh. "And what does Susan think about this?" "She's thrilled," Jack said, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "Says it'll be like old times. Old times. When Jack was her perfect little boy, and I was just the interloper who'd stolen him away." I could already imagine Susan's critical gaze, her thinly veiled barbs about my shortcomings as a wife and daughter-in-law. "Jack, I don't think." He cut me off with a wave of his hand. "It's decided, Claire. We're moving next week." I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. "Next week? But that's so soon. What about my job? Our house?" "You can commute," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "And we'll rent out the house. It'll be good for us, you'll see." I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him understand how ridiculous this all sounded. But years of keeping the peace had trained me well. Instead, I nodded, feeling like a coward. "I need some air," I muttered, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. "Where are you going?" Jack called after me. "For a walk," I said, not bothering to look back. The crisp autumn air hit me like a slap to the face as I stepped outside. I walked aimlessly, my mind racing with all the implications of Jack's announcement. How had we gotten here? When had my opinions, my desires become so insignificant? Lost in thought, I nearly collided with my neighbor Sarah. "Whoa there, Claire," she said, steadying me. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile. "Just got some surprising news. Jack wants us to move in with his mother." Sarah's eyes widened. "Susan, the woman who called you a barren disappointment at your last Christmas dinner?" I winced at the memory. "That's the one." "Oh, honey," Sarah said, pulling me into a hug. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't seem to have much choice in the matter." Sarah pulled back, her hands on my shoulders. "There's always a choice, Claire. You just have to be brave enough to make it." As I walked home, Sarah's words echoed in my mind. I'd spent so long trying to be the perfect wife, to make everyone else happy. Maybe it was time to start thinking about my own happiness. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed the unfamiliar car parked in our driveway. As I approached, I saw Jack emerge from the house, followed by a woman I'd never seen before. They were laughing, heads close together in conspiratorial intimacy. My heart stopped as I watched Jack lean in and kiss her cheek, his hand lingering on her waist. The woman climbed into her car and Jack waved goodbye, a smile on his face I hadn't seen in years. As the car pulled away, Jack turned and saw me standing there. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of panic. "Claire," he said, his voice strained, "I can explain." But in that moment I realized there was nothing left to explain. The perfect life I'd been desperately clinging to had been an illusion all along, and now, standing in the fading light of day, I knew that everything was about to change. The moving van pulled away, leaving me standing in Susan's driveway, surrounded by boxes and the suffocating weight of my new reality. Jack was already inside, probably basking in his mother's adoration. I took a deep breath and stepped through the front door, bracing myself for what lay ahead. "There you are, Claire." Susan's voice rang out, sharp as a knife. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind." I forced a smile, just making sure we didn't forget anything. Susan's eyes narrowed. "Well, don't just stand there. Start unpacking. I want this mess cleared up before dinner." As I lugged boxes upstairs, I caught snippets of Jack and Susan's conversation from the kitchen. Their laughter felt like a personal affront, a reminder of my outsider status in this house. "Claire?" Jack called. "Can you come down here for a sec?" I descended the stairs, my guard up. Jack and Susan were seated at the kitchen table, matching expressions of false concern on their faces. "Honey," Jack began, his tone sickeningly sweet, "Mom and I were talking, and we think it might be best if you take the guest room for now." I blinked, Sure, I'd misheard. Excuse me? Susan jumped in. It's just that Jack's old room is rather small for two, and well, with your difficulties, we thought you might appreciate the extra space. My difficulties. As if my struggle to conceive was a personal failing, a defect to be hidden away in the guest room. And where will you sleep, Jack? I asked, already knowing the answer. He at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. I'll take my old room. It'll be easier for work, you know? I bit my tongue, tasting blood. This was about more than sleeping arrangements. This was about erasing me, bit by bit, from their perfect family picture. Fine, I said, my voice eerily calm. I'll take the guest room. As I turned to leave, Susan called out, "Oh, and Claire, be a dear and start on dinner, won't you? I'm famished." That night, lying alone in the cold guest room, I replayed the scene I'd witnessed in our driveway. The woman, the kiss, Jack's panicked expression when he saw me. I'd been too shocked then to confront him, but now anger bubbled up inside me. I crept downstairs, intent on finally having it out with Jack. But as I approached his door, I heard hushed voices. "You need to be more careful, Jack," Susan whispered. "What if Claire had seen you?" My breath caught in my throat. "Don't worry, Mom," Jack replied. "Claire doesn't suspect a thing. She's too busy trying to be the perfect wife to notice what's right in front of her." I stumbled back, my hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. Susan knew. She'd known all along about Jack's affair, and worse, she was helping him hide it. Rage, hot and fierce, coursed through me. I wanted to burst into the room, to scream and throw things, but a small, calculating voice in my head held me back. If I confronted them now, they'd only deny it. No, I needed proof. I needed to play their game better than they did. Back in the guest room, I pulled out my phone and dialed Sarah's number. "Claire?" She answered, groggy with sleep. "What's wrong?" "I need your help," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm going to take down Jack and Susan, and I need you to be my alibi." There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice came back, fully alert. "I'm listening." As I outlined my plan, a sense of purpose washed over me. For years, I'd let Jack and Susan dictate my life, my worth. But no more. They thought they had me cornered, isolated in this house of lies. But they'd underestimated me. Let them think I was the perfect, obedient wife. Let them believe I was clueless and weak. I'd play the part, all while gathering the evidence I needed to blow their carefully constructed world apart. The game was on, and this time I intended to win. The fertility clinic's waiting room was a study in quiet desperation. I sat alone, surrounded by couples holding hands and whispering encouragement. Jack had begged off, claiming an important meeting. I knew better now. "Claire Thompson?" The nurse's voice cut through my thoughts. I followed her to the examination room, my heart heavy. Dr. Patel greeted me with a sympathetic smile. "I'm afraid I don't have good news, Claire," she said gently. "The latest round of treatments hasn't been successful." I nodded, numb. How many times had I sat in this room hoping for a miracle? "Have you and Jack considered other options?" Dr. Patel asked. "There are still avenues we could explore." "I'll discuss it with him," I lied, knowing full well that Jack had lost interest in our fertility journey long ago. As I left the clinic, my phone buzzed. A text from Susan, "Dinner at 6. Don't be late." I arrived home to find Susan in the kitchen, a whirlwind of activity. "There you are," she said, barely looking up. "Start chopping those vegetables. Jack's bringing a guest." My stomach clenched. "A guest?" "Yes, his new assistant. Amanda, I think her name is. Lovely girl." I nearly sliced my finger, my hand shaking with sudden realization. "Amanda, the woman from the driveway." "Oh, and Claire?" Susan's voiced with false concern. "You might want to freshen up. You look a bit worn." I bit back a retort and headed upstairs. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection. The woman looking back at me seemed older, tired. When had I become this shadow of myself? The sound of laughter drifted up from downstairs. I recognized Jack's voice, followed by a lilting female laugh that set my teeth on edge. I descended the stairs slowly, steeling myself. Jack stood in the living room, his arm casually draped over a young woman's shoulders. She was everything I wasn't. Young, vibrant, carefree. "Claire!" Jack called out too loudly. "Come meet Amanda. She's been a godsend at the office." I shook Amanda's hand, noting how she leaned into Jack. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she gushed. "Jack talks about you all the time." "Does he now?" I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. Throughout dinner, I watched Jack and Amanda, noting every shared glance, every accidental touch. Susan beamed at them, playing the perfect hostess. "So, Amanda," Susan said, refilling her wine glass, "do you plan on having children someday?" Amanda blushed. "Oh, I'd love to. I've always wanted a big family." "Unlike some people," Susan muttered, her eyes flicking to me. The room fell silent. I set down my fork, the clatter echoing in the sudden quiet. "I'm sorry, Susan," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Susan waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, nothing, dear. It's just, well, you've been trying for so long. Maybe it's time to accept that motherhood isn't in the cards for you." I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me," I managed, fleeing to the kitchen. I gripped the counter, trying to steady my breathing. The kitchen door swung open, and Jack entered. "Claire, what's wrong with you?" he hissed. "You're embarrassing me." I turned to face him, years of pent-up anger and hurt bubbling to the surface. "What's wrong with me? You bring your mistress to dinner and ask what's wrong with me?" Jack's face paled. "Keep your voice down," he warned. It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" I challenged. "Tell me, Jack. Tell me I'm wrong." He opened his mouth, then closed it, unable to form the lie. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I'd spent years trying to be the perfect wife, enduring Susan's jabs, Jack's indifference, the painful fertility treatments. For what? For this farce of a family? I brushed past Jack, back into the dining room. 3 pairs of eyes turned to me expectantly. "I have an announcement," I said, my voice ringing clear. "I'm not pregnant. I'll never be pregnant. And you know what? I'm done trying." With that, I walked out of the house, leaving behind a stunned silence. As I stood in the driveway, the cool night air on my face, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. The game had changed, and I was finally ready to play by my own rules. I found myself at my mother's doorstep, tears streaming down my face. She opened the door, took one look at me, and pulled me into a fierce hug. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, stroking my hair. "What's happened?" Inside, over a steaming mug of tea, I poured out everything. Jack's affair, Susan's cruelty, the failed fertility treatments. Mom listened, her face a mix of concern and barely contained anger. "Claire," she said when I'd finished, "why are you putting yourself through this?" I stared into my tea, searching for an answer. I wanted the family I never had growing up, the perfect marriage, the white picket fence, the whole package. Mom's eyes softened. "Oh, honey, is that what this has all been about?" She reached for an old photo album, flipping to a picture of us from years ago. There we were, just the 2 of us at my high school graduation, beaming at the camera. "Look at us," she said. "We might not have been the traditional family, but we were happy, weren't we?" I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "You don't need a man or a baby to complete you, Claire. You're already whole." Her words hit me like a tidal wave, washing away years of insecurity and doubt. I'd been so focused on creating the perfect family that I'd lost sight of what truly mattered, my own happiness and self-worth. "What do I do now?" I asked, feeling both liberated and terrified. Mom squeezed my hand. "You fight. Not for Jack or that sham of a marriage, but for yourself." The next morning, I returned to Susan's house with a renewed sense of purpose. I found Jack in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee. "Where were you?" he demanded. I was worried sick. I almost laughed at the absurdity of his concern. "I needed some time to think," I said calmly, "and I've made a decision." Jack's eyebrows shot up. "Oh? I'm moving out," I stated, my voice steady. "This isn't working, Jack. It hasn't been for a long time." He set down his mug, his face a mask of disbelief. "You can't be serious. What about our family? Our future?" "What family?" I countered. "The one where you cheat on me and your mother covers for you? The one where I'm constantly reminded of my failures?" Jack's face paled. "You know about Amanda?" "Yes, I know. I'm not as blind as you think I am." He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Claire, please, we can work this out. I'll end things with Amanda, I promise." For a moment, I wavered. This was everything I'd wanted to hear for so long, but then I remembered my mother's words, and my resolve strengthened. "It's too late, Jack. I deserve better than this." As I turned to leave, Susan appeared in the doorway, her face twisted with anger. "You ungrateful little," she hissed. "After everything we've done for you?" I stood my ground, meeting her gaze. "You've done nothing but tear me down, Susan. But I'm not your punching bag anymore." I brushed past her, heading upstairs to pack my things. As I threw clothes into a suitcase, I heard raised voices from below. Jack and Susan were arguing, their words muffled but their tones clear. Suddenly there was a crash, followed by silence. Alarmed, I crept down the stairs. In the living room, I found Jack on his knees, surrounded by shattered glass. Susan stood over him, her face a mask of cold fury. "You fool," she spat. "I told you to be careful, now look what you've done." Jack looked up, his eyes meeting mine. In that moment, I saw something I'd never seen before, fear. "Claire," he whispered, "there's something you need to know." I stood frozen, caught between the urge to flee and a desperate need to uncover the truth. Whatever Jack was about to reveal, I knew it would change everything. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the room, ready to face whatever came next. I stood in the living room, my heart pounding as I waited for Jack to speak. Susan's eyes darted between us, a mix of fury and fear in her gaze. "Claire," Jack began, his voice trembling, I can't have children." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. "What?" I whispered, struggling to comprehend. Jack couldn't meet my eyes. "I've known for years, long before we got married." The room spun around me as the implications sank in. All those fertility treatments, the disappointments, the blame I'd shouldered, it had all been for nothing. "You let me think it was my fault," I said, my voice rising. "You watched me go through treatment after treatment, knowing all along." Susan stepped forward, her face a mask of cold indifference. "It was for the best, Claire. We couldn't let people know Jack was defective." I recoiled at her words, disgust rising in my throat. "So you both decided to let me suffer instead, to make me feel like a failure?" Jack reached for me, but I jerked away. "I'm sorry, Claire. I was afraid you'd leave me if you knew the truth." A bitter laugh escaped me. "And this was better? Lying to me for years, making me think I was broken?" "You don't understand," Susan hissed. "Our family name, our reputation." "Your reputation?" I cut her off, fury building inside me. "Is that all you care about?" Suddenly, a memory flashed through my mind. Susan's smug face as she introduced Amanda at dinner. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. "That's why you brought Amanda into our lives," I said, turning to Susan. "You were trying to get Jack an heir, weren't you? With or without my knowledge." The guilty look that passed between Jack and Susan confirmed my suspicions. I felt physically ill. "How long?" I demanded. "How long have you been planning this?" Jack's silence was answer enough. I turned to leave, unable to bear another moment in their presence. "Claire, wait," Jack called after me. "Please, we can work this out. We can adopt or—" I whirled around, years of pent-up anger and hurt pouring out. "Work what out, Jack?" "The years of lies, the manipulation, the fact that your mother was basically pimping you out to your assistant?" Susan gasped, affronted. "How dare you? Everything I've done has been for this family." "No," I said, my voice cold. "Everything you've done has been for yourself, for your precious reputation." I turned to Jack, seeing him clearly for the first time. "And you? You're no better. You were willing to let me believe I was the problem rather than face the truth." Jack's face crumpled. "I love you, Claire. Please don't go." For a moment, I wavered. Despite everything, a part of me still longed for the life I'd dreamed of, the family I'd never had. But then I remembered my mother's words. I was already whole. "Love isn't supposed to hurt like this," I said softly. "It's not supposed to make you feel small and worthless." I walked to the door, pausing with my hand on the knob. "I'm leaving," I announced. "Not just this house, but this marriage. I deserve better than lies and manipulation." Susan sneered. "And where will you go? You have nothing without us." I met her gaze, standing tall. "I have myself, and that's more than enough." As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt truly free. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Sarah. "How'd it go? Do you need backup?" I smiled, realizing I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. With newfound determination, I typed my reply. "It's over. Can I crash at your place tonight? We have some planning to do." As I hit send, I knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of my story, not the end. I'd been staying at Sarah's for a week, plotting my next move when the call came. Jack's voice crackled through the speaker, urgent and pleading. "Claire, please, we need to talk. Mom's in the hospital." My first instinct was to hang up, but something in his tone gave me pause. What happened? She collapsed. The doctors, they're not sure. Please, Claire, I need you. Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing to meet him at the hospital. As I walked through the sterile corridors, my mind raced. Was this another manipulation? A ploy to get me back? I found Jack in the waiting room, his face pale and drawn. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable and lost. How is she? I asked, keeping my distance. Stable for now. They're running tests. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed. Thank you for coming. We sat in uncomfortable silence until a doctor approached. Mr. Thompson, your mother is awake. She's asking for both of you. Surprised, I followed Jack to Susan's room. She lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller and frailer than I'd ever seen her. Her eyes locked onto mine as we entered. Claire, she said, her voice weak. I need to tell you something. Jack tensed beside me. Mom, maybe now's not the time. No, Susan interrupted. She needs to know. I can't carry this anymore. I stepped closer, curiosity overriding my caution. What is it, Susan? She took a shaky breath. Jack's affair. It wasn't his idea. It was mine. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. What? I pushed him into it, Susan continued, tears forming in her eyes. I thought if he got another woman pregnant, we could pass the child off as yours. Save the family name. I staggered back, feeling as if I'd been physically struck. You orchestrated all of this? Jack reached for me, his face a mask of shame. Claire, I'm so sorry. I should have stood up to her, should have told you the truth. But I was beyond hearing his apologies. Years of pain, humiliation, and self-doubt crashed over me like a tidal wave. Every snide comment, every accidental meeting with Amanda, every fertility treatment I'd endured, it had all been part of their sick plan. How could you? I whispered, my voice shaking with rage. How could you do this to me? Susan's face crumpled. I was trying to protect our family, our legacy. I never meant what? I cut her off, my voice rising. Never meant to destroy my self-esteem? Never meant to make me feel worthless and broken? Never meant for me to find out? Jack stepped between us. Claire, please, she's sick. We can talk about this later. But I was done waiting, done being silenced. No, we'll talk about it now. You both used me, manipulated me, lied to me for years. And for what? Your precious family name? I turned to Susan, years of pent-up anger pouring out. You know what, Susan? You didn't just fail to protect your family. You destroyed it. Congratulations. With that, I stormed out of the room, ignoring Jack's calls behind me. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe. The weight of their betrayal pressed down on me, threatening to crush me entirely. But beneath the pain and anger, I felt something else stirring, a fierce determination. They had taken so much from me, but I refused to let them take anything more. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Everything okay? Need an escape plan? I smiled grimly, a plan forming in my mind. It was time to take back control, to show Jack and Susan exactly what I was capable of. I typed back, meet me at the house. It's time to end this, on my terms. As I left the hospital, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The final battle was coming, and this time, I was ready for war. The dining room buzzed with chatter as our friends gathered for what they thought was a simple dinner party. Little did they know, they were about to witness the implosion of my marriage. I moved through the room, a forced smile plastered on my face, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Jack hovered nearby, his eyes following me nervously. He knew something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Claire, darling. Susan's saccharine voice cut through the noise. She'd insisted on attending, despite her recent hospital stay. Everything looks lovely. I turned to her, my smile never wavering. Thank you, Susan. I'm so glad you could make it. As our guests took their seats, I caught Sarah's eye across the table. She gave me a subtle nod, reminding me of our plan. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Jack stood to make a toast, raising his glass. To friends, family, and new beginnings, he said, his eyes meeting mine in a silent plea. I let him finish, waiting for the perfect moment. As the clinking of glasses subsided, I slowly rose to my feet. I'd like to make a toast as well, I announced, my voice steady despite my racing pulse. Jack's face paled. Claire, what are you doing? I ignored him, addressing our friends instead. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. Your friendship has meant the world to me, especially during difficult times." A hush fell over the room. I could feel all eyes on me waiting. "You see," I continued, "Jack and I have been going through some challenges lately, fertility issues among other things." Susan shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Claire, perhaps this isn't the time." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time, Susan," I cut her off, my voice sharp. "After all, you've played such a crucial role in our marriage. Why don't you tell everyone about your brilliant plan?" Jack stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Claire, stop this, now." But I was beyond stopping. Years of pain and anger fueled my words. "Did you know that Jack can't have children? That all those fertility treatments I went through were for nothing?" Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Jack's face was ashen, his eyes pleading. "But that's not even the best part," I pressed on, my voice rising. "Tell them, Jack. Tell them about Amanda." "Who's Amanda?" someone asked. I laughed, a bitter sound. "Oh, just the woman Jack's been sleeping with. At his mother's suggestion, I might add." The room erupted into chaos. Friends looked between Jack and me, shock and disbelief on their faces. Susan attempted to interject, but I silenced her with a glare. "You see, Susan here thought it would be a great idea for Jack to get another woman pregnant, pass the baby off as mine to save the precious family name." Jack lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "Claire, that's enough." I wrenched away from him, tears stinging my eyes. "No, Jack, it's not nearly enough. For years, I've been manipulated, lied to, made to feel worthless. Well, I'm done." I turned to our stunned friends. "I'm sorry you all had to witness this, but I couldn't let their lies continue. I couldn't let them win." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Jack stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and shame. Susan had her head in her hands, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. As I looked around at the faces of our friends, some sympathetic, others horrified, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The truth was out. There was no going back now. "I think it's time for me to go," I said quietly, gathering my things. As I walked towards the door, I heard Jack's broken voice behind me. "Claire, please, don't leave." I paused, turning to face him one last time. "I'm not leaving, Jack, I'm escaping." With that, I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind the shattered remains of my old life. As I walked away from the house, I felt lighter than I had in years. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face it, on my own terms. The morning sun streamed through the windows of my new apartment as I sipped my coffee, savoring the quiet. It had been 3 months since the dinner party, 3 months of rebuilding my life piece by piece. The divorce papers sat on the coffee table, signed and ready to be filed. A knock at the door startled me from my reverie. I opened it to find Jack standing there, looking haggard and desperate. "Claire," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please, can we talk?" I hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. We sat across from each other, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. "I've left Susan's house," Jack began. "I've ended things with Amanda. I want to make this right." I studied him, searching for any trace of the man I'd once loved. "It's too late for that, Jack. You know that, don't you?" He nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "I know. I don't know how to live without you." For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old longing, the desire to comfort him. But then I remembered all the lies, all the pain. "You'll learn," I said firmly, "just like I did." Jack's gaze fell on the divorce papers. "So this is really it, then?" I nodded, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. "It is. I hope you find happiness, Jack, but it won't be with me." As he left, I felt a chapter of my life closing. But instead of grief, I felt a surge of excitement for what lay ahead. Later that day, I met Sarah for lunch. She grinned as I approached, raising her glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," she said. I clinked my glass against hers, smiling. "And to true friends." As we ate, Sarah leaned in conspiratorially. "So, have you thought about what's next? The world's your oyster now, Claire." I paused, considering. "You know, I think I might go back to school, finish that degree I put on hold when I got married." Sarah beamed. "That's my girl. Show them what you're made of." As we finished our meal, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Proud of you, sweetheart. Dinner tonight?" Warmth spread through my chest. Throughout this ordeal, my mother had been my rock, reminding me of the strength I'd inherited from her. That evening, as we sat in her cozy kitchen, Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "How are you really doing, Claire?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I took a deep breath, considering the question. "I'm okay," I said slowly. "Better than okay, actually. For the first time in years, I feel like myself again." Mom nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You know, when your father left, I thought my world had ended, but it was just beginning. Sometimes we have to lose everything to find ourselves." Her words resonated deep within me. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to fit into the mold of the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, how I'd lost myself in the process. "I think I'm ready to start living for myself," I said, surprised by the conviction in my voice. Mom smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "That's my brave girl." As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I was excited about the journey. Back in my apartment, I stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. I thought of Jack, of Susan, of the life I'd left behind. There was sadness there, yes, but also a profound sense of freedom. I picked up a framed photo from my bedside table. Me at my college graduation, young and full of dreams. I traced my younger self's smile, remembering the hope and ambition I'd once had. "Time to dream again," I whispered to myself. As I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was older, wiser, with a few more lines around her eyes. But there was a spark there that I hadn't seen in years, a spark of possibility, of life yet to be lived. I smiled at my reflection, feeling a surge of excitement for the future. The journey wouldn't be easy, but I was ready for it, ready to rediscover the woman I'd always been meant to be. As I drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. This isn't the end of my story, it's just the beginning. The sound of my purse unzipping made me jolt upright on the living room couch. My heart raced as I spotted Kyle, my new stepson, rifling through it greedily. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, anger surging through me. Kyle froze, clutching a wad of bills in his hand. "I was just borrowing some cash," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. I marched over and snatched my purse back. "You can't just steal from me. That money was for groceries." He glared at me defiantly. "Since when do I need permission to take what's mine? My dad makes enough to cover the little you spend." The sheer audacity of his words left me stunned. How did this entitled brat think he could justify thievery under my own roof? Alan rushed in from the kitchen, alerted by the commotion. "What's going on?" "Your son here helped himself to cash from my purse. Again," I said through gritted teeth. Alan's expression hardened as he turned to Kyle. "Son, you know you can't just take things without asking, especially from Marlene." "Why not?" Kyle scoffed. "You're the one who married this broke widow and brought her into our family." The venom in his words struck like vicious blows. I recoiled, feeling like an unwanted outsider being ungratefully tolerated in their home. Alan stepped towards Kyle, his fists clenched. "That's enough. You'll treat Marlene with respect. She's your stepmother now, and this is her house too." "Oh yeah? Well, maybe if you hadn't wasted your money on this loser." In a flash, Alan grabbed Kyle by the collar and shoved him against the wall. I gasped, my heart pounding frantically. "Don't you ever speak about her like that again," Alan growled, his face contorted with rage I'd never seen before. "Get out of my sight before I really lose it." Kyle shrugged off Alan's grip, straightening his shirt as he headed for the door. "Whatever, old man. You're both pathetic." The front door slammed, leaving Alan and I alone in a tense silence. He buried his face in his hands, sighing heavily. I'm so sorry you had to see that, Marlene." His voice quivered with a mix of anger and dismay. "No, I'm the one who's sorry," I said, fighting back tears. "If I'd known your son was going to cause so much drama, I never would have." "Don't say that." Alan gently took my hands in his. "Kyle's issues aren't your fault. I'll deal with him." I stared back at my new husband, my heart aching with doubts and insecurities. This wasn't the fresh start I'd envisioned when I agreed to marry Alan and move into his home. Kyle's resentment towards me had manifested more venomously than I could have imagined. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a storm that would shake the very foundations of my life. A darkness loomed on the horizon, and the relative peace I'd found after my first husband's passing was about to be shattered. Later that night, Alan and I sat in tense silence at the dinner table. both of us too shaken to have much appetite. The earlier blow-up with Kyle had cast a dark cloud over our newly merged household. "I need to explain some things about Kyle," Alan finally said, pushing his half-eaten plate away. "Things I probably should have told you before we got married." I felt a knot forming in my stomach, bracing myself for whatever troubles lay beneath the surface of his son's repulsive behavior. Alan took a deep breath. "Kyle's mother and we had a really nasty divorce when he was 14. Lots of screaming matches and ugly custody battles. She managed to turn him against me for years with her vicious lies." He shook his head slowly. "Then she hooked up with this real scumbag boyfriend who introduced Kyle to drugs, petty crime, you name it. By the time I got him back, he was already deep into that world, stealing, selling drugs, running with a bad crew." My eyes widened in disbelief. My God, I had no idea it was that bad. He's been in real legal trouble? "More than once," Alan said grimly. "Theft, possession charges, you name it. He's pulled himself out of some deep holes but keeps finding his way back into them." I stared at him, aghast. "If he's really that messed up, how could you allow him to just move in here after we married? He's putting us both at risk." "Because he's my son," Alan snapped, defensiveness flaring in his eyes. "Despite all his screw-ups, I can't just abandon him. He's got nobody else in this world." I wanted to argue, to insist that Kyle's very presence was a clear threat to the peaceful life I craved, the life I thought I was signing up for by marrying Alan. But I could see the anguish and guilt weighing heavily on my new husband's shoulders. "I'm sorry," I said, reaching across the table to grasp his hand. "I know you're in an impossible situation as his dad. We'll get through this together, okay?" Alan squeezed my hand tightly and managed a pained smile. "You have no idea how much it means to hear you say that. Most other women would have run for the hills by now." I tried to make light of the situation. "Well, I'm too stubborn and strong-willed to let a little thing like your criminal son scare me off." We both managed a gentle laugh, momentarily breaking the tension. But as Alan headed to take a shower, leaving me alone at the table, a cold realization crept over me. The casual theft from my purse had been just the tip of the iceberg. By welcoming Kyle into our home, we'd opened the door to a world of darkness, illegal activities, violence, and God knows what other dangers. I remembered the cocky smirk on his face as he insulted me mere hours ago. There was something chillingly sinister lurking behind those eyes, far beyond the brashness of typical teenage rebellion. A shudder ran down my spine. Had I grossly underestimated the depravity of this boy? No, this man whose twisted path in life could easily bring ruin to the new dream I was trying to build? I knew in that moment that dark days lay ahead. Kyle's very presence had instantly transformed my new marriage from a longed-for sanctuary into a minefield of constantly looking over my shoulder. And as I absorbed the full scope of the situation Alan had gradually let slip, one thing became crystallized in my mind. That vile, manipulative snake was not going to take away my hard-won chance at happiness without a brutal fight. In the weeks that followed, Kyle's audacious demands and destructive behavior only escalated. It was as if he viewed our home as his personal playground, thinking he could treat Alan and I as his servants. "I need some extra cash," he declared one morning, barging into the kitchen while I prepared breakfast. "My car payment's due." I shot him an incredulous look over my shoulder. "Your car payment? Maybe you should get a job and cover your own expenses for once." Kyle sneered. "Why should I work when my dad has so much money? Just give me what I need." "That's enough," Alan interjected sternly, entering from the living room. "I'm not just handing you piles of cash whenever you want it. You're a grown man. Act like it and get a job." In a blur of movement, Kyle swept his arm across the kitchen counter, sending plates, glasses, and silverware clattering to the floor in an explosion of shattered ceramic and glass. "You ungrateful old bastard," he screamed, his face contorted into an animalistic rage. "After all the hell I went through because of you." Alan stood motionless, seemingly petrified by his son's outburst. I jumped back, gasping as shards crunched under my feet. "Get out," I growled through gritted teeth, mustering all my courage. "Get out of our house right now, before I call the police." Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. With one last menacing glare at us both, he spun on his heel and stormed down the hallway, slamming the front door behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. Once his footsteps faded, I crumpled into a chair, struggling to fight back terrified sobs. Alan immediately moved to comfort me, wrapping his arms tightly around my shaking shoulders. His own eyes were glazed with moisture. "I'm so sorry, Marlene," he whispered hoarsely. "You never should have had to go through that." "You need to make him leave," I said, forcing the words out between shuddering breaths. "He's out of control. He's going to seriously hurt one of us." Alan drew back, cupping my face in his calloused hands. "I know, baby. After that explosion, I finally see he's too far gone." Thank God, I thought with a surge of relief. Finally, he was seeing sense. Or so I believed, until Kyle sauntered back through the front door 2 hours later, looking utterly unfazed by his meltdown. And he wasn't alone. Trailing closely behind him was a flashy woman in her late 20s with heavy eye makeup and tight, revealing clothes. Her disinterested scowl seemed permanently affixed on her face. Kyle flung his arm around her shoulders, grinning smugly at us. "Since you two don't seem to like me being around so much, I'll just have Diane here move in to keep me company." The blood drained from my face as Alan and I exchanged a look of disbelieving horror. Move his skanky girlfriend? No, this couldn't be happening. "Kyle, absolutely not," Alan warned, anger seeping back into his voice. "Don't you dare bring that kind of riffraff into our home." "Too bad, old man. It's happening," Kyle taunted. With that, he brushed past us both, pulling Diane down the hallway to what was originally Alan's study. "Oh yeah, you guys can move your little homework space to the garage," he called over his shoulder flippantly. "Me and Babe need our own bedroom." I slumped back into the chair, burying my face in my hands as the sounds of raucous laughter and thumping bass erupted from down the hallway. This nightmare was only getting worse, and my husband seemed powerless to rein in his monster of a son. Living under the same roof as Kyle and his disrespectful girlfriend Diane was a waking nightmare. Nights were filled with thumping bass from their room, shouting matches, and God knows what other disturbances. Worst of all were the little glimpses I'd catch of disturbing activities whenever I passed by their door, furtive figures coming and going at all hours, hushed conversations abruptly silenced by glares in my direction. It was becoming increasingly clear that more than just his obnoxious presence was pervading our home. Kyle was running some sort of illicit operation right under our roof, putting Alan and I at legal risk. One sweltering summer night, the hallway reeked of marijuana smoke yet again. I stormed down to their door and pounded my fist against it furiously. "Kyle, keep that crap away from our part of the house. I'm not letting you turn this into some kind of trap den." The door flew open, and Kyle's sneering face appeared in the cloud of smoke. "Back off, you dried-up old hag," he spat. "What I do in my room is none of your business." My jaw clenched with rage. It becomes my business when it's happening in my home and putting me in legal jeopardy. From over Kyle's shoulder, I spotted Diane lounging on the bed in a skimpy top, lazily scrolling on her phone as if nothing were amiss. "You want a nice, quiet home? Maybe you should have stayed a lonely widow then, instead of marrying into my family's problems." Kyle snarled. With a sudden shove, he sent me stumbling back. I lost my balance and crumpled hard onto the hallway floor, crying out in shock and pain as my elbow smacked against the wall. "That's it! You're out of here!" I heard Alan roar as he rushed in from the living room. "Don't you ever lay a hand on my wife again." He reached down to help me up, his face contorted in fury. For once, there were no hallowed pleas to his son, only unbridled rage. Kyle responded by spitting a huge gob of phlegm that landed squarely on Alan's cheek. The twisted smile on his face was one of pure malice. "Get out," Alan growled in a low, gravelly voice I'd never heard before. "Get out of my house before I bash your skull in and happily let the law deal with me after." Kyle cackled, seeming almost delighted at having provoked this normally mild-mannered man to the brink of violence. "Oh, I'll get out, old man. Just try and make me leave empty-handed after supporting my worthless life for—" Before he could finish, Alan's fist connected squarely with Kyle's nose in an explosion of blood and cartilage. Kyle crumpled to the floor with a high-pitched howl of agony. "That's for Marlene, you piece of garbage!" Alan spat down at his son, flexing his knuckles. The bravado disappeared from Kyle's demeanor as he cowered on the floor, cradling his gushing nose. "You'll pay for this," he blubbered through a torrent of blood and tears. "I'll make you miserable." Summoning whatever was left of my nerve, I forced myself to my feet and leveled an accusatory finger at Diane, who continued to sit casually watching the violence unfold. "Get this trash out of my house," I hissed. "Both of you, before we call the police and public services to forcibly remove you." For once the skanky woman's face betrayed a flicker of alarm, comprehending the very real prospect of legal consequences beyond this domestic dispute. In a flurry of motion, she gathered her and Kyle's belongings into ratty duffel bags as Alan and I watched stoically. With one last venomous look over his shoulder, Kyle allowed himself to be pulled out the front door, slouching away into the night, still cradling his battered face. Only when the rumble of their beat-up Honda had faded did we collapse into each other's arms, physically and emotionally spent from the turmoil. "I'm so sorry, Marlene," Alan rasped softly into my hair. "You didn't deserve any of this." Gently pulling back, I cupped his face in my hands and forced his gaze to meet mine. "No more apologies," I stated firmly. "That monster is out of our lives for good, and he's not taking anything else from us." Deep down, however, I knew it was too dangerous to rest on that conviction. The menacing fury in Kyle's eyes as he was ejected betrayed something far more unsettling than the tantrum of a spoiled brat. My stepson was unraveling into a vicious, vindictive menace willing to go to extremes in pursuit of revenge. And whatever dark dealings he'd been involved in, his pride and greed would never allow him to walk away without extracting a price. Alan and I had only begun to pay, but even we couldn't fathom how steep the cost would become. In the days after Kyle's explosive eviction, an eerie calm descended over our home. Alan and I walked on eggshells, constantly bracing for some form of retaliation that never came. "He has to be plotting something," I muttered to Alan one evening as we picked at our dinner in tense silence. "Kyle's not the type to just slink away." Alan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You're probably right. I have no idea what he's capable of at this point." We both jumped as my phone began ringing, the shrill tone shattering the quiet. I felt my pulse quicken as I saw the caller ID. It was my brother Eric. "Hello?" "Marlene, it's me." His familiar voice crackled over the line. I think we need to talk, in person." There was an uncharacteristic solemnity to his tone that instantly put me on edge. Eric wasn't one to mince words or ask to meet up unless something serious was going on. "What's this about?" I asked, unable to mask the tremor of worry in my voice. A pause. "It's about your stepson, Kyle. I've been looking into a few things. We should discuss it face to face." My eyes flicked over to meet Alan's concerned gaze. This couldn't be good. "Okay, come over tonight after you get off work," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I spent the next few hours in a state of nervous agitation, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios about what Eric might have uncovered. Was Kyle pushing drugs, involved in organized crime of some kind? The possibilities were chilling. When Eric finally arrived that evening, his face was taut and grim. He made a beeline for the couch and dropped his voice to a hushed murmur, glancing furtively around as if he feared we were being watched. "I've been piecing some things together through my contacts and databases at the precinct," he began in a low growl. "That kid of yours, Alan, he's mixed up in some seriously dangerous stuff." Eric ran a hand over his thinning hair. "Stolen identities, credit fraud, you name it. He's got an entire black market operation going, using those scumbag friends of his to siphon money and rip people off blind." I felt the blood drain from my face as realization dawned. The shadowy figures coming and going at all hours, the scrapped plans for Alan's study to become their lair, it all made sense now. "That's why he was so desperate to keep you from kicking him out," Eric continued grimly. "He needed to operate out of your home undetected. Guys like that, they'll do anything to keep their schemes going." Alan's face was ashen. Oh God, when I think of all the times he brought strange people around, started getting belligerent out of nowhere, he was protecting his crooked schemes all along. My brother leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as his eyes bored into ours with steely intensity. "Which is why the two of you are in very real danger. Kyle clearly has no limits to what he'll do, and guys involved in this level of fraud tend to have extremely dangerous connections. The unspoken suggestion hung in the heavy silence that getting on the wrong side of Kyle's operations could mean deadly consequences. "We need to handle this extremely carefully," Eric said, his expression grave. "One misstep and you could find yourself swept up into a world you don't want any part of." My heart pounded in my ears as the gravity of the situation became clear. That vicious, greedy snake of a stepson had turned our home into a den of criminality. And now he wouldn't stop until he'd exacted vengeance upon us for daring to defy him. I felt Alan's hand finding mine, gripping tightly as we digested this nightmare in silence. Our very lives could be at stake at the hands of his own unhinged son. With a resolute nod to my brother, I knew there was only one path forward, no matter how dangerous. We had to stop Kyle's malevolence, once and for all, and we would have to match his ruthlessness every step of the way to survive. Over the next few days, Eric worked feverishly behind the scenes to gather intelligence on Kyle's operation. Calls were made, surveillance footage poured over, shady contacts leveraged for any crumbs of information. Finally, he presented us with the bombshell. Kyle's crew was about to pull off a massive identity theft and fraud scheme, their biggest score yet, and he had the date, time, and location. "This is our chance to nail that piece of garbage once and for all," Eric growled, slapping a thick manila folder on our kitchen table. "I'll organize a sting with my unit to catch him red-handed." Alan and I exchanged anxious glances. Taking down Kyle's criminal empire was the obvious necessity, but the prospect of being intimately involved in such a high-stakes police operation filled us with trepidation. "What do you need us to do?" Alan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric fixed us with an intense stare. "We're going to use Kyle's greed against him. I'll have one of my undercovers reach out saying they have some high-value financial data to sell." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "And the two of you are going to be the brokers who set up the meeting, the ones who can get him to show up in person so we can grab his slimy ass." A tense silence stretched between us as Alan and I processed what he was asking. Not only would we be dangling criminal bait in front of that viper, we'd be serving ourselves up as targets to draw his fangs. But what other choice was there? We were already marked by his venom. Leaving him to run rampant would only ensure he circled back around to strike again when we least expected it. "Whatever it takes," I said firmly, squaring my shoulders as I met my brother's gaze. "If being part of the sting is what's needed to finally rid our lives of that cancer once and for all, I'll do it." Alan gave a grim nod of agreement, lacing his fingers tightly through mine. 2 nights later, we found ourselves seated at a seedy bar near the industrial district, my stomach tying itself in knots as we awaited our undercover's call signaling that the trap was set. The burner phone finally rang, and I felt my heart lurch into my throat. "It's go time," Alan muttered, eyes flicking around the dingy establishment as I answered the call with trembling hands. "Yeah, I got a hot new bank data dump to move," the gruff voice at the other end stated matter-of-factly. "You still looking to buy?" "Of course," I replied, struggling to keep my tone even and businesslike despite my inner turmoil. "My partner and I can meet with the merchandise in hand tonight, ready to make a deal if it passes muster." "Perfect. Warehouse District, 10 p.m. Listen for my message on the burn phone with the exact location in 30 minutes. The call clicked off abruptly, leaving Alan and I to await further instructions with bated breath. True to their word, a new text arrived giving us a specific address, a derelict factory on the fringes of the warehouse district. Isolated, cavernous, the ideal setting for criminal dealings to unfold undetected, or so they would believe. As we pulled up outside the rusting gates, my brother's message crackled urgently through the phone's tinny speaker. "Got you covered from all angles. Just play it cool and stay frosty. Units are in position, eyes on your target coming in from the east side." My chest tightened as the unmistakable growl of Kyle's beat-up Honda echoed off the buildings, pulling in through the far gates with its high beams blazing. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as the door slammed open, his hulking form emerging into the sickly glow of the street lamps. "Well, well," he sneered as he swaggered forward, flanked by 2 of his slimy henchmen. "If it isn't Dad and the little wifey." Despite the terror coursing through me, a surge of adrenaline-fueled determination washed over me in that moment. This soulless predator had tormented our family for the last time. With a subtle nod, I signaled that the game was truly afoot. Let the vipers ensnare themselves for one final act of retribution. Kyle swaggered forward, that same twisted smirk frozen on his face, the same one that had mocked me so many times during his reign of terror under our roof. "So what's this big score you mugs are trying to peddle?" he sneered, looking us up and down with contempt. "It better be good, or else this little reunion is gonna get ugly." I felt Alan tense beside me, but kept my own expression steely. "We'll let you inspect the merchandise first, if the price is right." Producing a weathered USB drive, I placed it squarely in Kyle's outstretched palm with a subtle nod to Eric's team lying in wait. The Viper's eyes lit up with greedy intrigue, his focus fully fixated on the promise of an illicit payday. With a grunt, he handed it off to one of his henchmen, who immediately got to work on a laptop, no doubt scrutinizing the data for any whiff of fraud potential. While they were distracted, my gaze landed on the other crony loitering nearby, idly scrolling through his phone, until I noticed the unmistakable glint of a knife peeking out from his waistband. My heart stuttered with a new surge of panic. These weren't just amateur crooks. They were strapped and ready for any potential violence. One wrong move, and this entire sting could devolve into a deadly crossfire with me and Alan caught squarely in the middle. I reached out and gave Alan's hand a subtle squeeze, hoping my brother's unit was as dialed in as they promised to be. "Looks legit," the henchman finally grunted after several tense moments, slapping the laptop closed. "Es money, as long as your crazy-ass family ain't trying to set us up." A sly smile crept across Kyle's lips as he leveled his gaze at us. "Now why would we want to do that? After all the fond memories?" His fingers closed tightly around the USB drive, the smirk morphing into a full sneer. "Maybe we'll take this little payoff and a little extra fee from dear old Dad to make up for all the grief your bitch put me through." My jaw clenched, fury blazing inside me. Of course, he couldn't let this go without one final sadistic jab. Too much to ask for a simple ending where the snake gets what's coming to him. "You must be stupider than you look," I spat back, fists clenching at my sides. "We're not going to just hand you money, you parasite." In a flash, both henchmen produced their weapons, leveling them squarely at us. I gasped, instinctively grabbing Alan and pushing him behind me as they fanned out in a menacing semicircle. "Maybe you didn't get the memo," the knife-wielding thug snarled. "We ain't asking for money. We're taking it. Drop 'em. You're surrounded." The barked command seemed to reverberate from all directions as the night exploded in a blinding haze of flashbang grenades. I blinked and coughed, struggling to see through the smoke and spot the source of the chaos. Suddenly, what seemed like dozens of black-clad figures materialized through the haze, weapons trained in a tight semicircle around Kyle and his stunned goons. "This is the police!" Eric's commanding voice boomed over a bullhorn. "Get on the ground with your hands up!" There was a tense beat of stunned silence, until the knife-wielder made the mistake of whipping his blade in a wild, yet unpredictable arc, met instantly with a searing volley of beanbag rounds from the officers slamming into his chest and abdomen. As he collapsed, wheezing, there was one final snap of resistance as Kyle made a panicked break for his car. But my brother was prepared, rushing out of the smoke to put him in a wrenching arm lock that sent him crashing to the pavement. "Kyle Turner, you're under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, and a whole host of other fun charges." Eric growled through gritted teeth as the cuffs clicked into place. "Anything you say or do will only make your life that much harder, scumbag." The still defiant scowl instantly drained from Kyle's face, replaced with naked terror as he finally grasped that the tables had turned and the ultimate consequences were closing in. As the officers hauled him roughly to his feet, his wild eyes met mine briefly, and I was flooded with the most intoxicating sensation of vindictive satisfaction. This sadistic tormentor who'd inflicted so much misery was finally, irreversibly, getting the brutal payback he deserved at the hands of righteous karma, and I was going to revel in every second of his downfall. The weeks following Kyle's dramatic arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, lurid media frenzies, and the gradual unraveling of the tangled web he'd woven. It seemed every time we thought we'd grasped the full extent of his criminal enterprises, more sordid layers would emerge. I watched it all unfold from the gallery with a strange sense of detached amusement. The smarmy swagger, the sadistic manipulation, the sheer delusion of entitlement, all of it had finally caught up to ensnare my stepson in its unforgiving karmic trap. His wretched girlfriend Diane was wrapped up in the dragnet as well, already flipped by the prosecution and ratting out every last depraved detail in a desperate bid for leniency. At this point, she was nothing more than a bug on the windshield to me, easily swatted away and forgotten amid the larger impact headed Kyle's way. Eric was relentless, leaving no insidious crevice of their activities unturned or unpunished. Fraud, money laundering, drug trafficking. Kyle's reckoning was swift and absolute. With the mountain of evidence stacked against him, it wasn't a question of if he'd be convicted, but just how many years he'd be burying himself alive behind bars. The jury has reached a verdict. Those 4 simple words from the judge's mouth sent an electric surge of anticipation through the courtroom gallery. Kyle stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, as his team of lawyers frantically conferred one last time. The foreperson rose and cleared his throat solemnly. On the charges of mail fraud, aggravated identity theft, and drug conspiracy, we the jury find the defendant, Kyle Turner, guilty on all counts. A muted shockwave seemed to ripple through the room, punctuated only by Kyle's lawyer slumping back in her chair, utterly deflated. His lips contorted into a silent snarl, though whether out of anger or resignation, I couldn't tell. As the remainder of the lengthy verdict was read aloud, something inside me began to uncurl and unfurl. A profound lightness I hadn't experienced in what felt like an eternity. The tightness that had gripped my heart for so long steadily dissipated with every guilty issued upon my tormentor. We shuffled out through the courthouse steps into a swarm of cameras and microphones from the awaiting press, my brother taking the lead to address the media frenzy. This case sends a clear and resounding message to those who seek to corrupt and victimize our communities, he boomed in that signature authoritative rasp. We will pursue them to the fullest extent of the law and bring the full hammer of justice upon their heads. As flashbulbs exploded all around us, I sought out Alan's eyes amidst the chaos. He gave me the faintest of smiles and a subtle nod. The ghost of the same weary, downtrodden man who'd been paralyzed by his son's long trail of transgressions had finally been exorcised. He too seemed to feel the lightening of our collective burden. That night, after the cameras and crowds had dispersed, we sat in peaceful silence on the back patio. Cicadas droned their evening chorus under a canopy of stars twinkling brilliantly in the warm summer darkness. So much had changed, yet felt startlingly unchanged at the same time. The house was precisely as we'd left it that fateful morning, and yet the oppressive storm cloud that had followed us home from the courthouse finally felt completely lifted. You know, I still have a hard time wrapping my mind around how far that sick bastard was willing to go, Alan said at last, cradling his beer bottle pensively. Just to what? Punish us for not enabling him anymore? I gave a slow shake of my head. At the end of the day, it was never really about us, just his own greed and depravity swallowing him whole. I thought back to that cold, chilling glare Kyle had leveled at me in the courtroom while receiving his sentence, not one of rage or hatred, but a fathomless emptiness. For all his blustering malice, he was now just an empty husk being justly carted away. He'll spend every day of the prime of his life rotting behind bars, I stated with grim finality, and all he'll have is that void where his soul should have been to keep him company. Alan nodded, the ghost of a smirk toying at the corner of his lips, as the cocoon of our nightmare finally shed away completely. So I guess that means we get to focus on filling our lives with better things now. You know, like a little peace and happiness for once. The enormity of that simple idea hung in the air, more revitalizing than the gentle breeze kicking up around us. Pulling me close, Alan pressed his lips to the top of my head, a kiss filled with a renewed sense of purpose and the untold promise of whatever lay ahead. For the first time in what felt like eternities, the horizon was wide open and full of possibilities. I'd say we've earned every last drop of it, babe. he murmured warmly against my hair. And I can't wait to start living it.